Today's lecture focuses on the basics of ethanol, how it gets in and out of the brain, what it does once it's in the noodle, and processes that occur over time. Alcohol pharmacology. Ethanol is a very interesting and in many ways unique source of intoxication. First of all, relative to other intoxicants, one puts a massive quantity of ethanol in one's body. Also, ethanol is both water and lipid soluble and permeates most organ systems of the human body. In fact, up until the last 25 years, the assertion among scientists was that there was no specific site of action of ethanol. Rather, ethanol acted directly on each organ system, impacted organ systems independently of each other. Although many of the deleterious long-term effects of ethanol derive from these direct sources of action, for example, alcohol-induced cardiac myopathy is a direct function of alcohol's effects on the heart muscle, we now know that the psychoactive effects of ethanol are principally the result of relatively specific neurophysiological actions. There is a constant rate of absorption of ethanol from the gut into the bloodstream. Also, ethanol metabolizes differently than any other psychoactive substance at a constant metabolic rate versus a rate based on the drug half-life. There are also significant differences in the metabolic rate of alcohol as a function of sex, and also, to a lesser extent, as a function of ethnicity-related genetic influences. More about all of these as we move through this lecture. Blood alcohol correlates. These are some general behavioral, affective, and cognitive correlates of various blood alcohol levels in typical ethanol users. Please note that we use the pharmacological as opposed to the legal nomenclature. Pharmacologists describe blood alcohol levels as milligram percent, which is a measure of weight to volume. 20 milligram percent is the amount of alcohol in one standard drink, to be discussed later. If you move the decimal point 2 places to the left, you will translate this measurement into the more frequently cited legal measurement of 0.20. 20 milligram percent equals 0.20 legal blood alcohol level. Both reflect a blood level associated with the ingestion and absorption of 1/2 ounce of pure ethanol. Let's look at a few of these bullet points. Most people start to experience a buzz after 2 standard drinks. Judgment starts to go south at 3 drinks, and this is when risky behaviors begin. Included here is the judgment that one has the capacity to manipulate a 4,000-pound vehicle through suburban and city streets with abandon. 80 milligram percent is a way too liberal cutoff for determining OUI status, operating under the influence status. For the sake of public health, the legal limit ought to be 0.60 or 60 milligram percent. Luckily, for most relatively naive drinkers, vomiting begins relatively early with 6 drinks in the bloodstream, quickly evacuating any remaining ethanol from the stomach. At 7.5 drinks, one has the equivalent of 1/2 pint of ethanol in the bloodstream. Blackouts, long taken as an indicator of alcohol dependency, are not that. Blackouts are simply a marker of having achieved a dangerously high blood alcohol level. They reflect high-risk binge drinking, not alcohol dependence or alcoholism per se. They are, however, a good way to assess high-risk drinking among college students, for example. For all but the most seasoned ethanol users, 400 to 450 milligram percent is a fatal dose of ethanol, and death occurs typically as a function of respiratory failure. Death at lower doses of ethanol, if not as a function of an accident or a knife stabbing, is typically a function of aspiration of one's vomit. You die from respiratory failure, an accident, or aggression, or perhaps from aspirating one's vomit, if vomiting while on one's back or while passed out. More about alcohol overdose a bit later. Standard drink. Here is an absolutely essential concept to understand: the standard drink or standard drink unit. Unless you understand what a standard drink unit, SDU, is, you will not be able to engage in any effective health behavior change conversations regarding ethanol use. I must start by noting that there are very precise ways to calculate SDUs and less precise but sufficiently effective for clinical purposes ways to calculate SDUs. In most clinical conversations, the meatball calculations are sufficient. SDU reflects a quantity of alcohol drink that contains approximately 1/2 ounce of pure ethanol. Proof is 2 times the alcohol percent. For example, 100 proof is 50% ethanol. A 100 proof vodka contains 50% ethanol by volume. The most precise marker for 1 SDU is 1 ounce of 100 proof distilled spirits. For example, an ounce of Wild Turkey 101. Other, more approximate 1 SDU units are listed above. Please note that, strictly speaking, 1 SDU of 80 proof booze is 1.25 ounces. However, the convention is to use 1 shot, which varies from 1.25 to 1.5 ounces, as the marker for 80 proof spirits. Up until recently, one spoke of 10 to 12 ounces of generic beer as 1 SDU. 10 to 12 ounces of Bud Light as 1 SDU. However, with the popularity of higher ABV brews, some tipping the scale at 8 to 9% ABV, one must now know the beer ABV to effectively calculate SDUs. ABV is the abbreviation for the percentage of alcohol in a given beer. This is how ethanol metabolizes in the human body. Most alcohol enters the human body through the GI system, although there is no reason to not ingest alcohol through the skin, rectally, etc. Once in the stomach, there is a constant rate of absorption, mostly as a function of limitations on how much ethanol can move from the stomach to the small intestine. It is in the small intestine that most ethanol passes into the bloodstream. This rate of absorption varies across humans, but is generally estimated to be an average of 4 standard drinks per hour. For male-bodied people and chronic ethanol users of both sexes, a small percentage of ethanol metabolizes in the stomach. This is called the MEOS, M-E-O-S system. Metabolizes in the stomach before entering the bloodstream via the small colon. The balance of ethanol is absorbed directly into the bloodstream. We will address other important gut-related issues a few slides from now. Once absorbed, ethanol first passes through the liver, the principal site of metabolism. This, by the way, is why the liver is so vulnerable to the influences of chronic ethanol use. ALDH breaks down ethanol into acetaldehyde, which is in turn broken down by ALDH, initiating a process that results in ethanol metabolites either staying in the body as fatty acids or leaving the body as water and carbon dioxide. It's actually ADH that breaks down ethanol into acetaldehyde, and then ALDH that breaks down the acetaldehyde into fatty acids, water, and carbon dioxide. The fact that ethanol eventually eventually metabolizes in this manner explains the fact that one can smell alcohol many hours after stopping drinking. Alcohol metabolizes into water and carbon dioxide, evacuates the body as sweat and via your breath, and that's what you smell when you smell that on somebody who has not been drinking for many hours. The fact that alcohol metabolizes into lipids is the reason that one often has problems related with cholesterol and lipid levels as a function of chronic ethanol use. Acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde is a chemical cousin to formaldehyde, the stuff that they preserved those dead frogs in back in 9th grade biology. It is nasty stuff and not a good thing to have hanging around in your liver. One needs just enough of it produced to clear the body of ethanol, but not too much or for too long. ALDH usually comes to the rescue, quickly ridding the liver of the former substance once ethanol has been metabolized. Under certain conditions, ALDH is insufficiently produced. In this situation, excessive quantities of acetaldehyde builds up in the liver, causing what is commonly called the flushing response, a highly noxious and sometimes dangerous clinical phenomenon. The flushing New York City response. The buildup of acetaldehyde yields a clinical picture significant for many of the following: nausea, hot flashes, heart palpitations, difficulty breathing, and the belief that death is at my doorstep. Some ethnic strains of East Asians have a genetically derived low capacity for the production of ALDH, which results in a naturally occurring flushing response upon ingestion of even small quantities of ethanol. This is widely considered to be a protective factor against the development of an alcohol-related disorder. Disulfiram, commonly known as antabuse, mimics this process by interfering with the production of ALDH, such that an individual who is taking disulfiram will experience the acetaldehyde poisoning effect upon ingestion of alcohol, including via the use of aftershave lotions, foods with alcohol, etc. Disulfiram is actually an effective way to decrease impulsive alcohol use, but only in an individual who is sufficiently motivated to put the cork in the bottle. Here's a fun fact. Recent pharmacological studies have suggested that acetaldehyde, not ethanol, is the psychoactive substance delivered to your brain via Jack Daniels, etc. Ethanol, if this is true, then becomes what we call a prodrug, a substance of import only because of what follows during metabolism. One might think of Mother Mary, for example, in the same manner. In any event, acetaldehyde is a chemical of great import. Gut-related concerns. Back to the bowels. If you want to maximize the rate of absorption of alcohol into your bloodstream, drink shots of high-proof alcohol, for example, Booker's Bourbon, Lab Alcohol, etc., and drink those on an empty stomach. If you want to slow the rate of absorption, last man standing effect. First, fill your stomach with chicken wings and Doritos, and then drink Bud Light. You can also try to screw around with the level of Gastro-Dehydrogenase in your belly. More about this on the next slide. Gastro-Dehydrogenase, G-ADH. G-ADH is the chemical that is at the core of the secondary metabolic system in the gut. Again, mostly in the gut of male body. Its presence is one of the few reasons that male-bodied individuals have a lower peak blood alcohol level than do female-bodied folks, drink for drink. We'll talk about this in a later slide. However, one can screw with the G-ADH levels in the gut in a variety of ways. If you want to get your money's worth out of those high-priced designer drinks from your favorite Southie bar, toss a few Tagamet down the old gullet en route. If you want to do the opposite, stop off at GNC and buy some zinc tablets. Tagamet maximizes blood alcohol level by minimizing G-ADH. Zinc tablets minimize blood alcohol level by increasing G-ADH levels. Steady state metabolism. Now that we're deep into the pharmacokinetics of ethanol, what happens when ethanol goes from the mouth to the belly to the bloodstream? Let's admire the unique way in which ethanol metabolizes. As mentioned earlier, all other drugs of abuse metabolize as a function of their half-lives. So, for example, if a drug has a half-life of 4 hours and one ingests enough to have 2 milligrams in the bloodstream, 4 hours later, 1 milligram is left in the bloodstream in the brain. If one ingests 4 milligrams, then 4 hours later, 2 milligrams are left in the bloodstream, etc. Ethanol metabolizes at a steady state. No matter how much ethanol is in the bloodstream, the same amount metabolizes per hour. Again, using meatball mathematics, we estimate that the average human metabolizes 1 standard drink unit per hour. This phenomenon yields some interesting observations, both about the nature of the ascending and of the descending curves of the blood alcohol level. One drink in, one drink out per hour. The most famous mantra of the alcohol behavioral self-control world is one drink in, one drink out per hour. 1 SDU in, 1 SDU out. Drop an ounce of Stoli 100 proof at the top of the hour, and 75 minutes later or so, depending on what's in your gut, your BAC will be back at 0. This is based on another meatball mathematical assumption. On the average, it takes 10 to 15 minutes for the Stoli to get from your belly into your bloodstream. But what happens if you drink more than 1 SDU per hour? Your blood alcohol level continues to rise. Practice calculating the blood alcohol rise in this individual who has a long episode of drinking with the following per hour number of SDUs ingested. Each number in the annotation reflects the number of drinks per contiguous hour. 4, 3, 1, 5, 2, 2, 0, 0, 0, 1, 5, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, etc. What is this person's BAC after 18 hours? Beginning with the top of the drinking period, the hour that they had 4. What will happen if he or she is pulled over and breathalyzed at that point in time, 18 hours later? Remember, 1 SDU in, 1 SDU out per hour. Here's another fun fact. The average human can absorb about 4 SDUs per hour. Anything more than 4 ingested per hour has to queue up in the gut, awaiting movement to the small colon and into the bloodstream. So calculate this one. How many hours will it take for all of this alcohol above to be absorbed into the bloodstream? What will be the peak, the highest BAC reached? use these numbers for this calculation. Person drinks 32 drinks in the first hour of drinking and simply doesn't drink anything else. 32 drinks up front, then stops drinking. How many hours will it take for those 32 drinks to be completely absorbed into the bloodstream at the rate of 4 drinks per hour? And given 1 drink in, 1 drink out per hour, what will be the peak blood alcohol level? At this point, please take a bathroom break, have a short whiskey and a smoke, and turn to the BAC calculations exercises that are available on campus. Please bring your results into class. Metabolic changes with chronic drinking. There are a few predictable changes associated with chronic use of alcohol. Please keep in mind that chronic use does not necessarily equate to problematic use. With chronic use of alcohol, the secondary metabolic system in the stomach that is found in most younger males develops into a system in the gut of chronic users of both sexes. This MEO system slows blood alcohol rise and also reduces peak blood alcohol level, i.e., there is less alcohol entering the bloodstream. Conversely, if and when one begins to evidence liver damage, the rate of metabolism in the liver decreases. The liver becomes less effective at breaking down ethanol. This is often called reverse tolerance. By the way, the progression of alcohol-related liver disease is as follows. Elevated liver enzymes, which actually can correct. Fatty liver, cirrhotic liver. Cirrhotic liver is a phenomenon where portions of the liver have simply died. It's diagnosable only via biopsy or autopsy. Elevated enzymes are an often very important wake-up call for the problem drinker and thankfully rebound to the normal range after a few months of abstinence or reduced drinking. Cirrhosis of the liver, again where portions of the liver die, can only be diagnosed via biopsy or autopsy. So if a client reports having cirrhosis, please query regarding, did you have a biopsy? Let's now once again turn to the phenomenon of pharmacodynamic tolerance and withdrawal. You'll recall that we discussed this first with regard to our discussion of the opponent process model of addiction. As with the other depressing drugs, including opioids, barbiturates, benzodiazepines, ethanol demonstrates pharmacodynamic tolerance and withdrawal. There is also often marked behavioral tolerance in the chronic alcohol user. This simply means that the individual learns how to maintain composure while under the influence. Metabolic tolerance is minimal as a function of alcohol ingestion. Again, metabolic tolerance is very limited in the alcohol user, so much so that we generally don't even talk about it. Pharmacodynamic tolerance develops rapidly in most individuals, but does bounce back to baseline with periods of abstinence. There are also significant genetically moderated differences in baseline level of tolerance. We will address this phenomenon when we discuss the genetics of alcohol abuse later in the semester. Interestingly, pharmacodynamic tolerance of alcohol is limited to the following alcohol-related effects: motor movements, hypothermia, sedative hypnotic effect, anxiolytic, anti-anxiety effect, anti-compulsive effects. There is no known evidence of tolerance developing to the cognitive degradation associated with acute alcohol use, including things like information processing and memory, judgment, executive cognitive functions. In other words, even when one demonstrates high levels of pharmacodynamic tolerance, when one's blood alcohol level is high, moderate to high, these cognitive processes still remain impaired. Henri Paul, the world's most famous high tolerance guy. Henri Paul had a blood alcohol level close to 360 mg/% when he drove Princess Diana through that Parisian tunnel back in, I believe it was 1998 or 99. What goes up must come down. Once one has developed tolerance to the effects of ethanol, there's a rebound effect. Those systems that adjust to accommodate to the noxious effects of alcohol during the A phase of the opponent process, i.e. during the ascending arm of the BAC curve, are slow to adjust to BAC drop during the B phase, the descending arm of the BAC curve. Ascending, BAC is going up, descending, blood alcohol level is dropping. This yields the classic array of withdrawal symptoms, often called true withdrawal. If you refer back to the list of systems affected by tolerance, in slide 19, you will notice that the above listed symptoms are by and large the opposite of the clinical picture of tolerance. Of greatest concern here is the decrease in seizure threshold during withdrawal. One monitors individuals during the withdrawal process, among other reasons, to keep an eye on the possibility of grand mal seizures. The possibility of grand mal seizures and cardiac symptoms is what puts the individual who is going through withdrawal at risk of serious debilitating illness and possibly death. Secondarily, the autonomic hyperactivity can also trigger a cardiac event, especially in those with compromised cardiovascular systems. One monitors individuals going through withdrawal for signs of seizure and cardiac-related symptoms. The CEWA. Everything that you ever wanted to know about the alcoholic withdrawal symptom. There is a full-size CEWA available in the resource section of Canvas. What is physical dependence? Here again is the assertion that the oft-cited in the popular press phenomenon of physical dependence is better labeled pharmacodynamic tolerance and withdrawal. And mantra number 2, physical dependence is best considered as a health consequence of chronic alcohol or other depressant use, not as a cause of addiction. We've talked about this before. So what happens when ethanol or acetaldehyde passes through the blood-brain barrier? As mentioned earlier, it has only been in the last couple of decades or so that pharmacologists have focused on the specific brain behavior actions of ethanol and its metabolites. They are both interesting in their own rights and also in the manner in which they are consistent with brain behavior actions of other drugs of abuse. Your brain on booze. We can unpack, and really do need to unpack to understand the psychopharmacological effects of ethanol as a function of the neurotransmitter systems impacted. As you can read in the slide, ethanol impacts a wide variety of neurotransmitter systems. as follows. Dopamine. Ethanol increases available dopamine in the midbrain system, facilitating the proponent process phenomenon of assentive salience and incentive sensitization. Ethanol also impacts the dopamine system in the prefrontal cortex, effectively knocking out executive cognitive functions. Opioid and cannabinoid systems. Ethanol-related activity here accounts for some of the more pleasurable effects of ethanol intoxication. When we talk later about medication treatments, we'll discuss how naltrexone functions by blocking the action of ethanol at the opioid receptor sites. Nicotinic receptors. A lot of positives occur as a function of this site of action, the nicotinic receptor sites. Also, the off-sited connection between smoking and drinking is in part due to the cross-priming of the nicotinic system, as opposed to just simply being a function of classical conditioning, of paired behavior. GABA, gamma aminobutyric acid system. Action at the GABA receptors explains the anxiolytic effect of ethanol, including a loss of inhibitions that both are experienced as pleasurable and also often account for episodes of alcohol-related violence. The action at the GABA receptors is the source of the off-sited stress reduction phenomenon associated with alcohol intoxication. Glutamate activity. Action at the glutamate receptor sites accounts for blackouts and other memory-related impairments associated with ethanol. So you can see how the specific clinical effects of ethanol can be understood as a function of ethanol's specific action at the various and disparate neurotransmitter receptor sites. The bright side, the things that happen as your blood alcohol level rises. During the ascending arm of the BAC curve, these neurotransmitter actions occur along with their associated effects. What goes up must come down, what comes down must go up. As blood alcohol level decreases during the descending arm of the BAC curve, these principally mirror actions occur. Available dopamine decreases, causing something called an elevated reward threshold that we'll talk about later, especially with respect to tobacco, nicotine, etc., etc. Brain chemistry rebound triggers more enduring discomfort. We need to distinguish between true or classic withdrawal, which is fairly short-lived and time-limited, and something that's a much longer, more enduring neurotransmitter-related rather than pharmacodynamic tolerance and withdrawal-related phenomenon that we call non-pharmacodynamic withdrawal. Available on Canvas is a brief paper that discusses the differences between classic withdrawal and non-pharmacodynamic withdrawal. The more enduring noxious states, those that endure beyond the pharmacodynamic readjustment period, are a consequence of these neurotransmitter changes, the bright side and the dark side. Brain reward threshold. You will note that the brain reward threshold elevates as a function of DA depletion during and after the descending phase of intoxication. This is a significant phenomenon that is isomorphic to the phenomenon of anhedonia in clinical depression. It looks like anhedonia, it quacks like anhedonia, and it likely has the same etiology as the classical symptom of anhedonia that's present in major depression or involutional melancholia, and also present in people with psychosis who are medicated with antipsychotics. Depletion of available dopamine in the midbrain system. During the protracted period of neurotransmitter rebound, the craving level drinker, and smoker by the way, is essentially on a positive reinforcement extinction trial. The threshold for experiencing something as rewarding is so very high that just about nothing except perhaps compulsive cigarette smoking is super threshold. This phenomenon triggers two related clinical phenomena. One is the malaise associated with protracted drug withdrawal, including in nicotine withdrawal, and also the increased salience of the DA-enhancing drug, to which the DA midbrain system has become highly sensitized, secondary to the context of an absence of competing high salience activities or reinforcers. So what does this do? Malaise and the fact that very few things will be registered super threshold as rewarding, except substances that hijack the DA system, that prime the sensitized brain. What does this yield? Relapse. It's a particularly big phenomenon in cocaine addiction and relapse. Before moving on, we have to address the phenomenon of the ethanol biphasic effect. We all know that ethanol is a depressant drug. However, during the first part of the first ascending arm of the blood alcohol curve, within an ongoing episode of drinking, alcohol actually acts as a stimulant. This is a neuropharmacologically grounded phenomenon, not just a function of alcohol use psychological expectancy. This phenomenon does not repeat during subsequent ascending BAC arms, for example, during a protracted period of drinking, followed by not drinking, followed by drinking again, where the blood alcohol curve would look more like a sine wave than ascending and descending Mount Everest. It is during this first ascending arm that the risks of alcohol-related violence is maximized. The stereotype of the fight between two completely obliterated people late in the night of drinking is simply not true. Alcohol-related violence tends to occur during the initiation of an episode of drinking rather than at its culmination. Secondarily, this stimulant effect occurs before the blood alcohol level reaches the level that triggers cognitive impairment and memory loss. Thus, what one recalls about an episode of drinking is phase one of the biphase, not phase two, the drunken stupor, loss of sexual function, etc. This is not a euphoric recall, so-called. It's a function of the correlation between a rising blood alcohol level and cognitive, especially memory impairment. So this is not a function of euphoric recall, but something much more neuropsychologically based. The biphasic effect phenomenon has become a very important talking point for those who work with college-age drinkers for all of the above reasons. Alcohol-sex differences. There are a variety of reasons that alcohol metabolizes differently and generally more slowly in female-bodied humans as follows. Alcohol rapidly diffuses in water, and males have greater body water percent than do female-bodied people. Females do not metabolize anywhere as much alcohol in the gut prior to ethanol entering the bloodstream as do male-bodied people. Estrogen moderates the metabolic level, the metabolic rate of ethanol, and rate of alcohol metabolism varies through the menstrual cycle accordingly. Finally, birth control pills often slow the metabolic rate of ethanol. All of these result in higher peak blood alcohol levels and a longer time to sobriety, to zero BAC. These are BAC curves for male-bodied and female-bodied individuals. The takeaway point is, if you're working with a female-bodied individual, make sure that they understand the difference in blood alcohol metabolism versus male-bodied peers and friends, because you don't want them to try to keep up with these male-bodied people without awareness of the potential consequences. Alcohol and cardio protection. For many years, there has been an assertion that moderate levels of alcohol use protect against the development of cardiac disease, the so-called J-shaped curve, where both teetotalers and heavy drinkers manifest greater levels of cardiac and other disease than do moderate drinkers. Ethanol in moderation does indeed promote healthier levels of so-called good cholesterol. However, these data have recently been called into question following the further investigation of the subjects evaluated in some of the seminal studies. It has been revealed that a good number of the teetotalers in these studies became teetotalers only after periods of heavy drinking that had led to health consequences. The increased health risks of this group are therefore contaminated by this factor. Alcohol and cancers. Recent data suggest marked concerns. Of further concerns have been recent reports of significant correlations between ethanol use and various cancers. The fact that chronic alcohol abusers often die of cancer has been known for years, but has classically been attributed to the historically high rate of tobacco use in this population. Current data sets, up to and including sets from 2020, have controlled for the tobacco-mediated effect and have found direct connections between ethanol use and a variety of cancers. This is especially true for female-bodied alcohol users, for whom there is now no known level of quote-unquote safe alcohol use. Interestingly, for male-bodied individuals, the previous suggestion of no more than 2 drinks per day has in the last few months been decreased to 1 drink per day for male-bodied users as a function of the most recent data reports on alcohol cancer connection. Again, acetaldehyde may be the culprit here. It may be that the carcinogenic effects of ethanol in humans is a function of acetaldehyde versus ethanol per se. These data have thrown into question established guidelines for healthy drinking, to be discussed at a later date. However, as with many, if not most, human activities that have a downside, alcohol use is indeed here to stay. Alcohol-Acetaminophen Syndrome. Got an alcohol-related headache? Fallen out of a moving vehicle while intoxicated? Whatever you do, do not, repeat, do not take Tylenol. We have known for a long time that chronic alcohol users who take acetaminophen often develop fatal liver toxicity. We now know that the ingestion of acetaminophen while intoxicated increases the risk of liver failure in all alcohol users, both casual and practiced. Medication-assisted treatment for alcohol problems. There are but 3 effective pharmacological adjuncts to alcohol misuse and dependence treatment. This is remarkable given the number of years and number of dollars that have been dedicated to discovering a magic pill solution. 25 years of investigations of medication-assisted treatment options, 3 evidence-based products. Disulfiram, mentioned earlier, blocks the metabolism of ALDH, triggering a flushing response if alcohol enters the bloodstream. Antabuse is helpful in support of abstinence in the committed individual and also is a key component of behavioral couples therapy for alcohol problems, where it is used to rapidly rebuild trust between the drinker and significant other with a daily ritual wherein both commit to a day of abstinence. Spouse first inspects the tablet and ensures that the tablet is antabuse. Also make sure that the tablet is actually swallowed rather than being cheeked and later spit out. Naltrexone, trade name Revia, an opioid antagonist, a slower acting version of the now famous naloxone Narcan, has been approved for the treatment of alcohol dependence for a dozen years or so. By blocking the action of ethanol or ethanol metabolites at the opioid receptors, naltrexone decreases the pleasure associated with drinking and has been shown to result in fewer drinks per drinking day, DDD. However, acceptance of naltrexone therapy among drinkers has been low due to lots of side effects, including headaches. Naltrexone is now available as a long-acting depot drug and is also promoted for PRN as needed use when one finds oneself in a high-risk situation, for example, going to a Willie J. student wedding. Acamprosate is a GABA agonist and serves to decrease the agitation and discomfort experienced during the protracted withdrawal phase. Combined use of naltrexone and acamprosate is the current cocktail of choice among pharmacologists, as the first compound decreases rate of high-risk drinking, and the second decreases reinstatement of drinking. Chantix and alcohol. There have been some interesting recent studies that have identified the therapeutic effect of Varenicline with regard to excessive drinking. There's a strong and interesting connection between nicotine and booze that we will discuss when we discuss nicotine. However, this observed therapeutic effect is independent of Chantix's effect on nicotine use. So we have in Chantix a drug that decreases urge to use nicotine. We know nicotine and alcohol are related both behaviorally and neurophysiologically, in addition to the way that Chantix decreases the urge to use nicotine. Chantix, independently of that, also decreases the urge to use alcohol. 2 independent, neurophysiologically separate functions of Chantix on these drugs. Now a bit about the diagnostic constructs of alcoholism, alcohol dependence, and alcohol use disorder. As mentioned in an earlier lecture, Edward Monkey Jellinek asserted a pluralistic model of alcoholism as early as 1960. He described 5 categories of alcohol-related problems, 2 of which he asserted were true diseases. Alpha alcoholism identified people who appeared to have a psychological reliance on alcohol. These folks would fit into our need category of substance misuse. Beta alcoholics were folks who were experiencing health consequences associated with their alcohol use. Health consequences, one of the triad of potential negative consequences associated with substance use, could be independent of quantity, frequency of use. Consider the person who discovers their gluten intolerance at their first kegger. And Jellinek in no way considered this a form of alcoholic disease. Epsilon alcoholics, also known as fiesta drinkers, were folks like your Uncle Max, who ties one on every Christmas Eve and ends up in the combat zone wearing nothing but a Shriner's hat and his socks. Gamma alcoholism, the first of the alcoholic diseases, described the phenomenon of the folks who then populated the halls of AA. These were folks who demonstrated all of the classic signs of DSM-3 and 4 alcohol dependence, including binge drinking, loss of control, tolerance, and progression, and often marked behavioral changes. They also often presented with a strong history of alcoholism in the family. Similarly behaviored alcoholism in the family. Why do the gamma alcoholics so closely map to the DSM-3 and 4 criteria? Because they were used as the prototype for alcoholism. DSM alcohol dependence syndrome was gamma alcoholism. We have an affirming of the consequent illogic going on here. One cannot say that the DSM-3 and 4 criteria for alcohol dependence are correct because they map out against the phenomenon of gamma alcoholics, because it was the phenomena of gamma alcoholics that determined the prototype for the DSM-3 and 4 alcohol dependence construct. Delta alcoholism, Jellinek's second disease, captured and captures a very different syndrome. The delta alcoholic is not a binge drinker, does not show evidence of progression, nor marked behavioral change, nor strong family history of alcohol intoxication and drunkenness. The delta alcoholic is the daily ritualized drinker. 3 martinis every day at 5 p.m. while sitting on the lazy boy watching reruns of Friends. The delta alcoholic indeed develops often strong pharmacodynamic tolerance, and this sometimes only comes to light when he or she has to precipitously stop drinking, such as when hospitalized or undergoing surgery, etc. The phenomenology of the delta alcoholic has not been well captured by the DSM. Jellinek first described the gamma alcoholic. Edwards and Cross, 2 British psychiatrists, refined this construct in a very influential 1976 paper, and the DSM carried this ball forward into the 21st century. And as a function of this, underrepresented the delta alcoholic dependency syndrome. Delta alcoholics, for example, do not evidence the so-called cardinal symptom of loss of control. Interestingly, behavioral genetic research strongly suggests that the loss of control phenomenon seen in gamma alcoholism has more to do with enduring ECF dysregulation than with anything specific to alcohol misuse, and is both a precursor of and a risk factor for the development of substance misuse. And the nasty head of dopamine here in regard to the PFC is reared again. We'll talk about this loss of control as a pre-existing or precursor cognitive dysregulation phenomenon when we talk about developmental and genetic influences on substance use. Not on alcohol use per se, but on substance misuse more generally conceived. DSM-5 moved away from the gamma alcoholism-derived construct of alcohol dependence to a slightly more inclusive construct, alcohol use disorder. AUD also stands as the prototype for all of the other specific substance use disorders of the DSM-5. The same criteria are carried forward with only slight modification to cocaine use disorder, cannabis use disorder, et cetera, et cetera. Why change your mind when you've got it all figured out? We have one criterion in the DSM-5 list of criteria that is consistent with the proponent process model, cravings and urges. And two that harken back to the older, discredited opponent process model, tolerance and withdrawal. And two that acknowledge the role of acute intoxication. And a whole bunch that very correctly identify alcohol misuse as a social construction, i.e., doing things that make it hard to function in the industrialized world, not meeting social and role obligations, being a bad citizen, or one of reputable character. So think back to the three circles of alcohol or substance-related problems: intoxication-related, health-related problems, and social problems. And we see the importance of social problems as they manifest as criteria in substance use disorder, DSM-5 circa. Finally, we see the assertion that lack of self-control somehow maintains the whole thing in these three criteria. So as we end this lecture, I point you in the annotation to a link to a very interesting video that demonstrates what happens when you try to get stinking drunk on powdered alcohol. You may have heard of the PALCOHOL controversy circa 2018, 2019. People were raving about how alcohol was going to turn your children into lunatics right under their noses. So we end this introductory lecture on the ins and outs of ethanol here.